How Abraham Lincoln Changed the Fate of a Nation. The air in the U.S. Capitol was thick with a tension that felt less like political disagreement and more like the brittle silence before a great shattering storm. In late 1860, the nation wasn't just divided, it was fractured, a union held together by a thread about to be snapped by the weight of millions of souls in bondage. This is not just the story of a war. It is the almost unbelievable tale of a self-made man born in a dirt floor cabin who would become the pivot point upon which the American experiment either succeeded in its grand promise or collapsed into the dustbin of failed republics. The unlikely crucible from log cabin to lawyer. The man who would save the Union began life far from the halls of power, in a barely lit log cabin in Kentucky on February 12, 1809. Abraham Lincoln's early life was a relentless test of endurance against poverty, illiteracy, and profound personal loss. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, died when he was 9, a tragedy that might have broken a lesser spirit, but Lincoln found solace and instruction in books. He devoured the few volumes available, the Bible, Aesop's Fables, and the life of George Washington, often reading by firelight, internalizing the bedrock principles of justice, morality, and self-governance. His formal schooling was meager, perhaps a year in total, yet his mind was sharp, hungry, and uniquely structured for logic and argument. He worked as a rail splitter, a flatboat man, and a store clerk in New Salem, Illinois. It was here that his signature blend of honesty, folksy humor, and intellectual power began to emerge, earning him the famous nickname Honest Abe. His ambition was not for wealth, but for influence. He taught himself law, passing the bar in 1836, and soon became known throughout the Illinois circuit as a brilliant litigator, a man who could distill the most complex legal principle into a simple, compelling truth. Crucially, his years traversing the vast, diverse landscape of Illinois gave him an unparalleled understanding of the American heartland and its citizens, their grievances, their aspirations, and their deeply conflicting views on the moral stain of slavery. The Gathering Storm, Politics and Principle. Lincoln's political career began as a Whig in the Illinois state legislature, then moved to a single impactful term in the U.S. House of Representatives. But it was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 that allowed for the expansion of slavery into new territories through popular sovereignty that shocked him back into the national spotlight. For Lincoln, this wasn't mere politics, it was a profound moral failure. He believed the founders had tolerated slavery only as a necessary evil that they expected to eventually wither away. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, however, marked a bold, aggressive attempt to nationalize the institution. Lincoln famously declared that if slavery was not wrong, nothing is wrong. This conviction led him to the newly formed Republican Party, an organization dedicated to preventing the expansion of slavery. His defining moment came during the 1858 Senate debates against Stephen Douglas. Though he lost the election, the debates turned Lincoln into a national figure. His speeches, clear, morally grounded, and rhetorically devastating, laid bare the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the nation: a republic dedicated to liberty, existing half slave and half free. He prophesied, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." The election that broke the nation, 1860. The 1960 presidential election was a four-way contest that perfectly mirrored the nation's fragmentation. Lincoln, the Republican, ran on a platform of halting slavery's expansion. The Democratic Party split. Stephen Douglas represented the northern wing, advocating popular sovereignty, while John C. Breckinridge represented the Southern wing, demanding federal protection for slavery. A fourth party, the Constitutional Unionists, tried to ignore the issue altogether. The result was a stunning political victory for Lincoln. He won the presidency with less than 40% of the popular vote, but a clear majority in the Electoral College, having swept the northern states. The South saw this not as a Democratic defeat, but as a death warrant for their peculiar institution. Within weeks of the election, South Carolina seceded, followed quickly by 7 other deep Southern states. By the time Lincoln arrived in Washington, D.C., sneaking into the city under threat of assassination, the Confederate States of America had already been formed. The nation was at war with itself before its new president was even sworn in.
A reluctant commander, the challenge of war. In his first inaugural address, on March 4, 1861, Lincoln appealed to the South's better angels, arguing that, physically speaking, we cannot separate. His plea was ignored. On April 12, 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln faced a task that would have crushed a lesser man. He had no military experience, yet he became the commander-in-chief of a massive, bloody conflict. His early years in office were defined by military incompetence, political dissent, and devastating Union losses. Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, Fredericksburg. He struggled to find a competent general, famously cycling through leaders like McClellan, who was perpetually afflicted by the slows. Meanwhile, his own cabinet was a collection of ambitious, often contemptuous rivals who believed they, not Lincoln, should be leading the country. Lincoln managed this team of rivals with a masterful, almost shocking patience, utilizing each man's strength while enduring their personal slights. His strategy was simple yet revolutionary: preserve the Union at all costs. He recognized that the fight was not just about geography, but about the very soul of the Republic. If the Union could be shattered over a disagreement, the entire democratic experiment, the idea that people could govern themselves, would fail worldwide. The moral turning point: emancipation. As the war dragged on, the initial goal of merely preserving the Union began to shift. The Confederacy was using enslaved people as laborers to support its war effort. Lincoln realized that striking at slavery was not only a moral necessity, but a critical military strategy. After the costly and inconclusive Union victory at the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln finally issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a bold, unprecedented use of executive power, declaring that on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the states currently in rebellion shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. Political masterstroke. It redefined the war from one about political union to one about human freedom, instantly blocking foreign powers like Great Britain and France, who had strong anti-slavery sentiments, from intervening on the side of the Confederacy. Military tool. It encouraged thousands of enslaved people to flee to Union lines, crippling the Confederacy's infrastructure and providing the Union with crucial new soldiers. Over 200,000 African American men and women would eventually serve in the Union Army and Navy, turning the tide of manpower. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the fate of a nation, giving the war a new, moral purpose that galvanized the North and ensured that even if the South surrendered, the institution of slavery would not be returning. A Nation Reborn. Gettysburg and the Second Term. In July 1863, the simultaneous Union victories at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and Vicksburg on the Mississippi River marked the high water mark of the Confederacy. The South would never again launch a major invasion of the North, and the Union now controlled the vital Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. 4 months later, at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. In 10 perfect sentences, lasting barely 2 minutes, Lincoln redefined American history, asserting that the nation was conceived 77 years ago, 1776, not just in political agreement, but in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The sacrifice of the war, he argued, was to ensure that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It was a promise of a new birth of freedom. The war's end finally came into sight with the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as General-in-Chief and the brutal, effective total war campaigns of William T. Sherman. Despite profound war weariness, Lincoln won re-election in 1864, a victory that validated his policy and guaranteed the war would be fought to the bitter end. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, as victory was imminent, Lincoln spoke with a tone of profound humility. He urged Americans to act with malice toward none, with charity for all, focusing not on retribution, but on binding up the nation's wounds. The Final Sacrifice, a legacy cemented in tragedy. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Union was saved. Just 5 days later, on the evening of April 14, 1865, while attending a play at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot by Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth. He died the next morning, becoming the first American president to be assassinated. Lincoln's death was the ultimate tragic sacrifice. He had guided the nation through its darkest hour, abolished the institution of slavery, and fundamentally secured the principle of American democracy. His martyrdom instantly solidified his legacy. The grieving nation, North and South, saw in his death not only the loss of a president, but the loss of the man who promised a gentle peace. His improbable journey from the dirt floor of a Kentucky cabin to the monumental task of preserving and redefining the American experiment is the central, most powerful, and astonishing true story in the nation's history. He did not just win a war, he delivered a new birth of freedom, ensuring that the Declaration of Independence was not merely a document of political separation, but a living testament to the equality of all men.